Pope has been visiting Iraq and he spoke out against extremism, presumably religious extremism and presumably Islamic extremism, because large parts of Iraq were taken over by ISIS, which stands for the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. And the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria only exist as an entity because of the Western intervention in Iraq in 2003, and ISIS began as Al-Qaeda in Iraq and were then expelled from Al-Qaeda for being too extreme. So the question has been asked, why didn't the Pope back then, it was a different Pope in 2003, John Paul II, do more to prevent the war in Iraq or the invasion of Iraq? And he did speak out against it at the time, but it was kind of a token effort. He didn't fly there to be some kind of human shield, which some people did. Eric Levy did, good friend of the channel. 93-year-old Eric Levy was out there as a human shield, and the Pope wasn't. So it is a bit hypocritical when these leaders, Western leaders, and he is a Western leader, the Pope, talk about peace, but they never put their money where their mouth is. And it's interesting that he's visiting Iraq and denouncing Islamic extremism in Iraq, because the Western powers that invaded Iraq, the coalition of the willing, they were the reason that ISIS is in Iraq at all. Saddam Hussein, who used to run things in Iraq as leader of the Ba'ath Party, the secular Arab nationalist dictatorship that was in control of Iraq back then, they would not have anything to do with Al-Qaeda types. They'd lock you up even if you were just a moderately extreme Muslim Brotherhood type of Islamist, never mind the further radical Al-Qaeda and ISIS type. So it's the Western powers' fault that ISIS took control of large areas of Iraq, and having headed to Iraq to get rid of a secular Arab nationalist leader in the form of Saddam Hussein, based on a pack of lies about him being able to attack us within 45 minutes, which was absolute nonsense. Having ousted him, having executed him by way of hanging, they have now facilitated ISIS extremists to fill that vacuum of power, and they are now back in Iraq to get rid of ISIS, and they are dropping bombs on Iraq to try and get rid of an entity who they facilitated in taking control of parts of the country. It's kind of like the old woman who swallowed the fly and then swallowed the spider to catch the fly, and so on and so on and so on. Are they that stupid? Or was this all part of a greater plan? I'll let you decide. But it is very strange to see someone like the Pope rocking up in Iraq talking about extremism when the same extremists next door are celebrated. Why is it that the Western powers, on the one hand, are bombing the Al-Qaeda militants in Iraq, whilst arming and aiding and training the Al-Qaeda elements in Syria? Doesn't make sense. The victories for the Western powers in Iraq against ISIS are celebrated, but when the so-called moderate rebels take control of parts of Syria, that's celebrated. And these so-called moderate rebels, it's been said before, they only chop half your head off. They are from the same mindset, the same ideology, the Al-Qaeda extremist mindset. And I wonder why the Pope decided to head to Iraq, the head of the Roman Catholic Church. There aren't actually that many Roman Catholics in Iraq. There are a lot of Iraqi Christians, and many of them have fled, and they've of course been heavily persecuted by the extremists that have taken control of parts of Iraq. But it does get confusing because there are Christian sects such as the Chaldean Catholic Christians, which Tariq Aziz was, for example, a member of. This was Saddam Hussein's second in command, who was a Chaldean Catholic, which is a form of Assyrian Christian, and they are members of the Eastern Orthodox Church. So Syrian Catholics, Chaldean Catholics, although it has the name Catholic in it, don't get confused, it's actually part of the Eastern Orthodox Church. It's not Roman Catholic. And the Eastern Orthodox Christians, it seems to me, have often assimilated better or felt more close to their Muslim neighbours in the Middle East, whereas the Catholic Christians, Roman Catholic Christians in the region, perhaps might have been more drawn to the West, or would have fled to go and live in South America with their co-religionists. I'm thinking of the Maronite Christians in Lebanon, who, although not in full communion with the Bishop of Rome, their doctrine is pretty much the same as the Roman Catholic Church. During the Lebanese Civil War and the factions that were fighting against each other, the Maronite Christians, the phalangists, sided with the invading army invading from the south against their fellow Arab Muslims, although the phalangists began to not even see themselves as Arabs. Even though they spoke Arabic, they clung to a different identity, a Phoenician identity, a pre-Arab identity, whereas a lot of the Orthodox Christians would have been siding with the Palestinian factions that were resisting the invasion in Lebanon from the south. And even one of the members of the Syrian National Party, a suicide bomber, a young girl who blew herself up, she became known as the Bride of the South. She was of a Eastern Orthodox background rather than the Catholic background. So it does seem that in terms of Middle Eastern Christian denominations, the Eastern Orthodox have always sided more closely with their Muslim brethren, and the Roman Catholic Christians might have felt more inclined to be pro-Western, to be pro the imperial powers that came to control the region. But of course there are exceptions to every rule, and I'm making a sweeping generalization, and if I'm wrong I want you to correct me, but that's just the impression that I get of this situation. And I did wonder what it would be like if the Pope visited Syria, where I think there might be slightly more Roman Catholics in Syria than there are in Iraq. Would he be denouncing the religious extremism? Would he be denouncing the religious extremists that are attempting to oust Bashar al-Assad, the secular Arab nationalist leader? And there have been members of the Orthodox clergy whom have aligned themselves very closely and shown support for the president in Syria. I'm thinking of the Serbian bishop, I think, who visited Syria and pledged his allegiance and solidarity with Bashar al-Assad. Bashar al-Assad is, of course, strongly supported by Vladimir Putin, and he has close advisors and supporters from the ranks of the clergy in the Russian Orthodox Church. So I think Russia's intervention in Syria, late arrival, and at the invitation of the government in the country, intervention and not invasion, was partly a duty to their fellow co-religionists in Syria, the Orthodox Christians, who were in grave danger and under great threat from these invading Takfiri fanatics. And I visited the Christian town of Malula in Syria just over a year ago, and I saw the destruction and the real pain in the hearts of the people of how they'd suffered at the hands of these religious extremists. So it would have been interesting if the Pope had stopped off in Syria on his way over to Iraq. It's on the way, isn't it? He could have popped into the town of Malula, where they still speak Aramaic, the language of Jesus, where I heard the Lord's Prayer uttered just the way Jesus would have said it. I would like to have seen the Pope speaking out against the extremism in Syria and Iraq.